Hi, and welcome to the Awakening series where we bring brilliant minds together. Today we have an honored guest. Her name is Jeanette Peacock. She's the founder of Learn to Learn Now, a training and development company that transforms struggling students into learning and productivity experts. Jeanette is also the founder and board chair of Stepping Up for Children in Need. Also, the Annette Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to equipping underserved and at-risk kids with the skills they need to launch themselves into lives of success. Most recently, Jeanette is driving into a new mission, one born from her own story, that she believes will have the power to save lives. Jeanette, thank you so much for your time. It's such an honor to have you on the show. We're so blessed to hear your journey. I cannot wait for everyone to really listen and learn about what you have to say, because it is impactful and powerful and it can save lives.
Let me just jump in by saying that you already know, because you know me well, that I am a mission-driven person. And you mentioned in the introduction my two ventures, Learn to Learn Now, which is my training company, and Stepping Up for Children in Need, the Annette Foundation, which is a nonprofit that I launched in early 2019. And by the way, this foundation is named in honor of my sister Annette, who was a former teacher and a humanitarian to the nth degree, and one of the people that I was most blessed in my life to know. At Learn to Learn Now, we're on a mission to create a new generation of young people who are learning to become learning and productivity experts. And we're doing that so that these young people can grow into adults who have the power to constantly reskill and reinvent themselves on demand so that they can stay relevant in this ever-changing work environment and always be in control of their earning potential, no matter the shift to technology, no matter the shift to artificial intelligence. So that's Learn to Learn Now, and that's our mission. Our mission at Stepping Up for Children in Need, the Annette Foundation, is to level the playing field for those kids who need it most, kids at risk. And our goal is to equip these kids with coping skills, learning skills, and productivity skills so that they can thrive today and launch into lives of success. So those are my two current missions, but I'm not here today to talk to you about either of those. Instead, I want to tell you and your viewers about a new foundation that I'm working on. And it's a foundation that I intend to launch either later this year or sometime at the beginning of the next year. And while I'm completely committed to my existing missions, I know without a doubt that this new foundation will truly be the most important thing that I ever do in my life. And I hope that it will become my life's legacy. So I know that normally you have a conversation, Kimberly, with your guests, but I'm going to ask you and your guests to bear with me, because what I'd like to do is tell you and your viewers my story. And I want to do that so that they can understand why this new mission of mine is so critical. And it's critical not only to me and my family, it's critical to not only you and your family, but it's critical to them and their families. How does that sound? Is that okay with you?
Yes, please, and thank you. Can't wait.
Okay, great. So viewers, listen up. The lessons you're about to hear, the wisdom I'm about to share is for you. So I'm going to jump in by saying lots of families have family businesses, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So my family actually has a family business too. And while some families own things like restaurants together, or some families are made up of a particular profession, like lawyers or doctors, my family's business, it's not anything like those. It's a bit different. And I'll share with you that it's definitely not the kind of business that most people would voluntarily sign up for, because my family is in the family business of cancer. And not because we're doctors or nurses, none of us are research scientists, not for any of those reasons. We're actually on the other side of cancer. We're on the patient side. And I'll tell you that we're nothing if not a participating group, because 5 out of 10 of my immediate family members, so 50% of us, either have been treated for and cured, or in more cases than not, have died from one form of cancer or another. And as I'm sure you can imagine, if we could have chosen any other field, any other type of family business, we would have. But we didn't have that choice. And cancer is our family business. And because it is our family business, we've gotten pretty darn good at tackling cancer head on. So what I'd like to share with you today is my family's cancer journey. And I want to share the lessons that we've learned along the way, lessons that have been hard won, because I believe these lessons can save your life and the life of the people you love if you pay attention. So just like any other family business, our family business had to be launched. And launched it was in January of 1998. And being the overachiever that I happen to be, I'm the one who had the great honor of launching our family business. So here it is, 1998, and I'm the mother of 2 baby boys. I'm a VP of operations for a Fortune 500 company, and to do well in that job, I'm working a minimum of 60 hours a week. And on top of that, I was also helping take care of my grandmother, who was suffering from Alzheimer's at the time. In addition, I also had hypothyroidism. And for those of you that don't know, hypothyroidism is a common thyroid condition. But what it does is it has the tendency to make people very tired. And tired I was. In fact, I was exhausted almost the entire year of 1998. And for a while, I'll tell you that I thought that was pretty normal. I mean, I was pretty busy. So I thought that was okay. But just to be on the safe side, because that's just the kind of girl I am, I scheduled an appointment with my thyroid doc, my endocrinologist. And I told him that I thought something had to be wrong. My body didn't feel quite right. And he said to me, "Oh, you mothers, you just don't realize how tiring motherhood can be." And then he went on to say that I was just spreading myself too thin and I needed to do a better job of managing my time. Now, I'll share with you that was an unbelievably ironic statement for that doctor to say, because I trained people time management and productivity for a living. So not only was I offended, I was feeling like a fool. He was admonishing me for sharing with him my concerns. But just to appease me, he did some blood work and he sent me on my way and he said, "Everything is A-okay. You're perfectly fine." But over the next few months, instead of feeling better, I felt worse. And I also started to get some other strange symptoms that simply were not normal to me. So, for instance, I started to have a really hard time getting up in the morning, and I could barely keep my eyes open past 8 o'clock. In fact, when I would put my children to sleep, more times than not, I jumped right into bed with them and fell asleep right along with them. And then I started to lose my voice. And I found some swollen lymph nodes right here in my neck. And that scared me. It scared me enough to brave my doctor's ridicule and make another appointment just to make sure that maybe something wasn't being missed. So back I went to my doctor. He once again told me I was just fine. There was nothing wrong with me. And this went on for just about a year, this back and forth. My symptoms didn't go away. I'd schedule an appointment. I'd go in. And finally, this doctor said to me that in his estimation, I was a hypochondriac. And when I say in his estimation, what I mean by that is that this doctor actually wrote in my medical chart, my permanent medical file, that would have been shared and has been shared with every medical provider since that time, that I was a hypochondriac. He diagnosed me as being a hypochondriac. Well, finally I thought, I'm not feeling any better, and maybe this guy is wrong. I mean, he's only human. So I decided I was going to get a second opinion. And I went to a new doc, and she was as concerned about my symptoms as I was. And she wanted me to see a neck surgeon. So off I go to see this new neck surgeon. And instead of taking me into an exam room, he takes me into his office, and he picks up his phone and he dials my endocrinologist's number because they just happen to be colleagues. And he gets him on the phone, he puts him on speaker, and he says, "Hey, I've got your patient Jeanette here, and she's wanting me to check out her lymph node. She's been referred by somebody else. What do you want me to do?" And my endocrinologist said, "Don't waste your time. Don't bother examining Jeanette. There's nothing wrong with her. She's a hypochondriac." I kid you not. That's exactly what happened. So I leave that office, and I'm finally convinced that there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with me, since not one, but two specialists had told me so. But to my great fortune, it just so happened that I was promoted the very next week, and I moved to Memphis, Tennessee within a few months. And once I got there, I had to establish new patient care with a bunch of different doctors, including an endocrinologist, because I needed to have my thyroid medicine that would keep my disorder under control. And here's what happened in that new patient appointment. Now picture this. I'm sitting on a chair and I'm wearing a scarf. It's tied around my neck. And I did that because hypothyroidism causes the thyroid gland to become enlarged. And being vain, as I sometimes could be, I always wore this scarf tied around my neck. And so I'm sitting there. The doctor comes in. He's a very nice man. He introduces himself. He sits down on his little doctor stool. It has the wheels on it. And I start to take off my scarf. And as I did so, this doctor got a very strange look on his face. And he rolled over to me on his little doctor chair. And without another word, he started to palpitate my neck, just like this. And then he said something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. He looked me in the eye and he said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I'm 99% certain that you have a malignancy. A malignancy." And I said, "No way. I'm a hypochondriac. I don't have cancer." But as it turns out, I wasn't a hypochondriac. I had stage 3 thyroid cancer. And stage 3 means that the disease had spread beyond the thyroid gland to 25 lymph nodes and had metastasized to other parts of my body. So here I am, 33 years old. I have 2 sons under the age of 3, and I had cancer. And that cancer had unnecessarily spread. And because of that, my life was now at risk, simply because a doctor had failed to hear me, simply because he assigned a hypochondriac diagnosis instead of taking me seriously, and simply because he didn't order a diagnostic test, which would have taken less than 15 minutes, that would have diagnosed me early as opposed to late. Now, I was actually very lucky because I was cured of my disease. But on the other hand, because the disease had gone undiagnosed for so long and therefore been able to spread so far, I now have an extremely high chance of having a reoccurrence, having radiation-induced secondary cancers. And though, knock on wood, that hasn't happened so far, there's not a day that goes by in my life that I don't feel as if I have a target on my back, a cancer target, and that the odds are I'm going to be struck again. And I fear for that every single day. And the lesson I learned from that experience, and the lesson I want you to hear, the lesson I want you to take note of, is that each of us must become informed advocates of our own health and the health of those that we love. When we're in doubt, when we feel uncomfortable talking to doctors, we should always, always have someone with us who can listen and ask questions on our behalf, who can become our advocates. Because it's so easy to be intimidated by doctors, especially in our culture, where most of us are raised to believe that doctors are infallible, that doctors have all of the answers, that doctors know it all. But that's not the case. Doctors are as human as you and I. We've got to be strong enough to stand up to doctors who tell us that nothing is wrong, especially when we know that our bodies just don't feel right. And we need to accept that doctors make mistakes. They're human. And with that knowledge in mind, be sure to always get a second opinion when things just aren't adding up. And insist on diagnostic testing that can rule out the possibility of a life-threatening disease before it actually can take your life. So that was my first lesson. That's the first step my family took into our family business of cancer. And it's your lesson number 1. So now let's jump into 2007. And here's the story that goes with that. I just picked up my boys from school. I was making the 20-minute commute back to home, and I got a call from my dad. Now, here's the thing. My dad and I were always close. In fact, I'm not ashamed to say that I am completely a daddy's girl, and I will be a daddy's girl until the very day I die. But we'd had a falling out. And given that we both had a tendency to be stubborn, neither one of us would give in. And we hadn't talked in almost a year. So when I saw my dad's name flash on my caller ID, I thought to myself, Ha ha, I win. Dad has finally given in. But when I answered the phone, I heard something I didn't expect. I heard fear in my dad's voice. Because as it turns out, just moments before, my dad, the man to whom no other could possibly compare in my book, had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. So I didn't win anything that day. Instead, my dad had just joined me in our family business. Now, I'll tell you that my dad was the kind of guy that was never sick a day in his life. Not until he started to get severe heartburn. And this went on for months. And he'd been back and forth to his doctor no less than 10 times prior to his diagnosis. But his doctor failed to order a simple scope of his esophagus, which, by the way, is the standard procedure for patients presenting with symptoms like my dad's. My dad wasn't scoped until he was taken to the ambulance, to the nearest ER, coughing up blood, in a state of shock, and very near death. So like me, my father, by no fault of his own, had a missed cancer diagnosis. And by the time he was finally diagnosed, he was diagnosed at stage 4. And that means that the disease had moved beyond his esophagus, had spread to the lymph nodes throughout his chest, and had moved to several organs, which are called distant metastases, and had moved even into his brain. But he was still thinking clearly enough at that time to know that with cancer in his brain, he wouldn't be the best person to make decisions for himself. And so, because of my experience with cancer, because I had interacted with doctors and understood what questions to ask, what decisions to make, my father assigned me medical power of attorney. And that gave me the power to make decisions for him. And then my siblings and I, we jumped into action. We got our dad into the best cancer facility in the area, which was a satellite branch of MD Anderson. And while my dad was getting settled into his room, my siblings and I went and spent time in the family waiting room. And there we met a woman. And she was the wife of another esophageal cancer patient. Now, her husband had been diagnosed over 5 years earlier. And when he was diagnosed, he was told that he had just 3 to 4 months to live. And it was the advice that was given to him at the time was that he should not seek treatment because his disease was too advanced. Well, we took a very important lesson from that woman. She said to us that day, no matter what the doctors tell you, there is no way for them to know how any given patient will respond to treatment. And she went on to tell us that had her husband accepted the advice of his medical team and refused treatment, he would have died a long time ago. In fact, within days of his diagnosis. Instead, here this man was, sitting next to his wife 5 years later. And yes, he was in the hospital, but not because he'd had a cancer relapse. He was there for a minor complication. So now, people with esophageal cancer, they develop tumors in their throats, and these tumors make it hard to eat and hard to drink. And that was absolutely the case for my dad. So he needed a surgery to place a feeding tube in his stomach. But the surgery failed. It failed because my dad's stomach was so completely full of cancer by this time that there was literally no place to insert and place that feeding tube. So the surgeon closed my dad up. And while he was in recovery, his oncologist team came to me and they advised me to refuse treatment. They advised me to let my dad die. And the doctor said that they anticipated that that death would occur in no more than 2 days. And all I could think of were the words of that woman. I could hear her in my head. So I puffed up my chest. I stood as tall as I could to give myself confidence. And I looked those doctors straight in the eye and I said to every single one of them, there is no way I am going to let my dad die without trying everything within my power to save his life. And because I have medical power of attorney and you don't, I get to call the shots. Now, I wish I could tell you that my dad was cured, but sadly, that's not his story. Instead, my dad died just 8 weeks after his diagnosis. But during those 8 weeks, every single tumor in his body shrunk, every single one of them. In fact, many completely disappeared, including the ones in his brain. My dad died from treatment-induced organ failure. He did not die from cancer. My father did not die from cancer. Had my dad been just a little bit younger, had he not smoked for 30 years and maybe been in just a little bit better shape, the odds are my dad would have lived. He may not have lived for more than 5 years, but he would have had that time. So lesson number 2, never give up, no matter the advice you're given, because everyone responds to treatment differently. And there's no way for any doctor to know how any given patient will respond. I'm here to tell you I'll never regret the decision I made to give my family 8 more weeks with our father. 8 weeks more that my father had with us. And when my father was on his deathbed, shortly before he died, he gathered us together and he said to us, he never wanted us to feel guilty. He wanted us to know that he knew and would go to his death knowing that his children loved him enough to do everything they could to keep him on earth. So fast forward to 2016. In the spring of that year, my older sister, Annette, the Annette of the Stepping Up for Children in Need, the Annette Foundation fame, she started having some headaches and she felt some weakness on her right side. And by the next week, Annette woke one day and she couldn't dress herself. And she couldn't stand the sound around her. She couldn't tolerate light. Every time she stood, she would lose her balance and she would stumble. So my brother-in-law, Tom, he took her to the emergency room. And when she got there, they did an MRI. And that MRI revealed a mass in her brain. And that mass turned out to be a glioblastoma. Now, glioblastoma is nothing more than a fancy word for the very worst kind of brain cancer there is. And my family, we were in shock because Annette, she was the least likely of all of us to join our family business. I mean, she was a self-proclaimed health food nut, and she rarely ate anything that wasn't organic. She rarely drank. She exercised like a fiend. And she always, always wore sunscreen. And yet she had terminal brain cancer. But my brother-in-law, he decided that his wife was not going to die without a battle. So he immediately started researching glioblastoma, and he started researching clinical trials that were studying it. Now, he didn't know anything about clinical trials. He just dove in. What Tom discovered was that the world of clinical trials is very confusing. It's hard to navigate. And trial eligibility is determined not only by the disease state and a patient's genetic mutations within that disease state, but it's also determined by the treatment, the very treatment that's given to a patient after diagnosis. So I want to say that another way because I really want this to sink in for you. I want you to hear me. Patients are very, very often denied acceptance into clinical trials because of the treatment they get that makes them ineligible for trials that very well could have saved their lives. But because my brother-in-law was who he was and was able to keep his head about him despite the fear he felt, despite the terror that the rest of us felt, he educated himself. And he knew not to let my sister start any treatment. Instead, by doing his homework and working diligently to get Annette's medical records and her biopsy slides into the hands of trial coordinators, Tom was able to get my sister accepted into a trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan, where they were studying glioblastoma and were showing very good results with their treatment protocol. So off Annette and Tom and I went to Manhattan to chase this clinical trial. And Annette had great response for just about 10 months. But at the end of that 10 months period, her tumor reoccurred and she was dropped from the trial. But before that happened, before Annette was dropped, before she reoccurred, Tom had already figured out the next clinical trial and had her lined up to join a trial at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. Annette thrived in that trial for another 4 months, at the end of which time, she was scheduled to receive the next phase of the trial. And that phase was to have live herpes virus implanted directly into her brain. This treatment was showing amazing success, not a cure, but an extension of life. And we were truly hopeful, truly hopeful. But just a few days before that scheduled procedure, Annette began to experience excruciating pain in her head and her neck and her back. And we learned that her cancer was back. It had moved into her spine, which happens in less than 1% of glioblastoma patients. And my sister died 10 days later, just weeks before her 55th birthday. And that was a very, very hard thing. But there's great wisdom to be taken from my sister's experience and my brother-in-law's quick action. And this is your next lesson. And I want you to listen to this one too. I want you to listen to it very carefully. For those cancers that are well studied, for which the standard of care yields excellent results, there's no need to chase trials like we chase those trials. But For those patients with difficult to treat, poorly understood, and understudied forms of cancers, participation in clinical trials can and does save lives. In fact, in more cases than not, it's the only chance of survival. What you need to know is that the treatment protocols offered through trials are typically years, if not decades, ahead of the standard of care available to the general population being treated at local hospitals and even cancer centers around the country. Decades ahead of what's available to you at your local hospital. So being aware of and knowing how to get accepted into clinical trials is an absolute must for those patients facing difficult to treat cancers. And it's also critical to remember that the type of treatment received upon diagnosis can and does eliminate patients from clinical trials that could have saved their lives. So, should you or someone you love be diagnosed with cancer, you have to ask, what's the standard of care? How long has this standard of care been in use? What results does it promise? And are there any trials going on that offer me or my loved one better outcomes? And doctor, can you help me get into those trials? And I want to tell you to be firm, because medicine is a business. And just like any other business, profits are earned by generating revenue through a customer base. And make no mistake, cancer patients are our hospital's customers. And doctors want to keep their customers at their locations because they generate revenue for their cancer programs. Navigating the world of clinical trials and gaining participation is your third lesson. It's the third lesson my family learned, and it's the third lesson you need to take to heart. I also want to share with you that that third lesson was followed just 4 months later in my family by my mother, who joined her family business with a diagnosis of squamous cell skin cancer. And I want to tell you that my mom had learned those first 3 lessons really well. I mean, she was on top of her care. She never hesitated to get a second opinion. She always had friends or family present to serve as an advocate for her when she thought she might get confused or feel bullied by her doctors. And she always insisted on diagnostic testing. Yet, despite all of that knowledge, despite understanding those lessons, my mom, well, she was a bit off of her game. I mean, my sister had been ill, her daughter had been ill, and she ignored some symptoms that she typically would have been all over. But by the time she went to the doctor, by the time of her diagnosis, my mother had literally less than a week to live. And it happened so fast. But there's still a lesson to be learned from my mother's experience, just like the rest. And here it is. So 2 days after my mom's diagnosis, she went to the emergency room. She wasn't feeling well. She felt nauseous and she was lightheaded. And by the time that my younger sister, who lived in the area, arrived at the hospital, our mom was delirious. And her longtime doctor, who was well known to my sister, took my sister aside and she said to her, "Fran, it's time to get your mom to hospice." Now, we were very familiar, very well acquainted with hospice. They'd been at my home during my dad's last days. And they'd been with Tom and me to help us when Annette took her last breath. But what's important for you to know is that those two experiences were radically different. My dad's passing was painless, it was peaceful, it was calm. Annette's was anything but. And the difference was in the quality of the hospice care that each received. In one case, a nurse was with us around the clock, making sure that my dad was comfortable, that he was pain-free, and that he was coaching us on how to help our father let go of this world and let go of us. In my sister's case, a nurse visited just once a day. And on day 7, she decided that Annette, though being in a coma, she wasn't dying quickly enough. She thought that because Annette was lingering, it meant that her body wasn't in a disease-derived coma, but instead that she was in a medically induced coma. And so she insisted that we cut Annette's pain meds in half. And her thinking was that it would make Annette wake back up and then Annette would have more time with us. But that's not what happened. Annette didn't wake back up. Annette remained in a coma. But while in that coma, she went into severe physical and respiratory distress. And she stayed that way until the moment she died. That was one of the most horrible experiences of my life. And I'll never forgive myself for not putting up more of a battle. But I'm going to tell you that I felt bullied by this nurse. I felt as though I was being accused of causing my sister's death by deliberately over-medicating her. I felt that my hands were tied. My sister, she did not have a peaceful death. She did not have a pain-free death. And it didn't have to be that way. So with that experience fresh in my younger sister's mind, she fought to get our mom into a hospice facility. And this facility was staffed round the clock with the most compassionate people I've ever met. And it was under their expert care that my mom passed away so peacefully, that despite lying right next to her in her bed, I had no clue that she'd taken her last breath. I had no idea that my mom had died until my dog, who was there in the hospice room with us, started to frantically bark and frantically tried to get to me from the couch to the bed. And when he did that, it was only then that I knew our mom had left the earth. So, lesson number 4. It's hard to think about death. It's hard to think about the death of the people that we love. But you must register with hospice as soon as a patient's condition worsens. If round-the-clock care isn't provided by your local hospice organization, try as hard as possible to get your loved one admitted to a hospice facility. Death shouldn't be anything but peaceful, anything but pain-free, and good hospice care guarantees that that happens, while bad hospice care does just the opposite. So now I come to the most recent and by far the most difficult part of my story. And I want you to know before I share it that I believe with every part of my being that every step of my family's journey up to this point, every lesson I learned, every bit of wisdom I carry within me was meant to prepare me to help the newest and, in my opinion, the very least welcomed member to our family business. But before I jump in, I want you to do something for me. I want you to picture in your mind a child you love dearly. And if you don't have a child of your own, I want you to picture someone else's child, a child that you love. And I want you to see that child happy and healthy and healthy. And I want you to see that child's future burning bright. Now feel the joy of knowing that that child's life will be a full and long life. And hold on to that feeling as you listen to the rest of this story, so that you might have even the slimmest chance of understanding the horror of what I'm about to tell you. So I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I have two sons. And since the moment that they were born, I, like all parents, envisioned long, healthy, loving lives full of unending promise and joy for my children. But in August of 2019, I was living in Denver, and I got the type of call that every single parent dreads. They're terrified of getting. And that call went like this. Get on a plane right now, this very minute. Justin's in the intensive care unit, and he has 105-degree fever. He's septic. The doctors have no clue what's wrong with him. It's bad. You need to get here as fast as you can. Well, getting to Orlando, Florida from Denver, Colorado, it's not an easy thing. And I know that I didn't even hang up that phone as I was running to my car, and I know for sure I didn't pack a bag. Instead, I called my younger sister as I sped to the airport, and I said to her, get me on any flight to Orlando that will get me there as quickly as possible. I don't care how much it costs, just get me to Orlando. And by the time I arrived at the airport, a Southwest agent was waiting for me. He got me checked in. He got me through security in record speed. He ran with me to the gate where the plane was being held for my arrival before taking off. I will forever be grateful to Southwest Airlines because I got to Orlando just in time to be with my amazing, compassionate, loving firstborn son as he learned that he had a rare and very, very difficult to treat form of leukemia called Philadelphia chromosome positive acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or Ph positive ALL for short. So the standard of care for Ph positive ALL that's available to the general population treated at local hospitals and cancer facilities is to inhibit the mutation that comes along with that chromosome, the Philadelphia chromosome. And they do that through drug therapy. Then they get patients into remission as quickly as possible. And after that, off to a bone marrow transplant before a patient has the chance to relapse. That's the standard of care. But that protocol offers patients like my son less than a 50% chance of survival at year 5, which in the world of leukemia equates to cure. So the standard of care offered to my then 24-year-old son was less than a 50% chance of living. You can imagine my response to my son's diagnosis and to the idea of accepting the standard of care when I knew through my own experience, through the experience of my sister, from my father's experience, that there would be trials out there better able to treat the disease. And we knew how to get my son into those. I mean, I was on the phone the moment my son dozed off. I was calling friends in the clinical trial space, connections that I recently and coincidentally just made in the leukemia space. And my brother-in-law, who was our clinical trial expert in our family, he was doing exactly the same thing. So that before Justin woke back up just an hour later, I had a guarantee of treatment for my son at one of the leading leukemia hospitals in the country. And I was making plans to take my child there. But here's the thing. And this thing is the basis for the last lesson I've learned. And I want you to learn it too. My son was an adult when he was diagnosed. And that meant he was legally in charge of making the decisions for his treatment. But there was a big problem with that, because when Justin arrived at the emergency room, he was literally bleeding out. He was bleeding from his mouth, from his nose, from his ears. He was barely conscious, and he was absolutely delirious. We were told later that had Justin's friends not gotten him to the hospital when he did, he would have died within just hours. He was that close to death. Now, my son he's so smart, so high achieving, so independent, and he's been independent since the time he was 3 years old. But he was in a state of brain fog, and he didn't know it. He didn't know that he wasn't thinking clearly, and yet he was the one calling the shots for his care, and he shouldn't have been. He was convinced by his lead doctor that the standard of care was his best shot. There was nothing I could say to convince him otherwise. There was nothing that I could do but settle in to take care of my child. And other than watching my son suffer through the side effects of chemo, there was nothing in my life harder than having to accept that decision. Never in my life have I felt more helpless. Never in my life have I felt more despair. I stopped looking into other options because the knowledge of what my son was passing up was just too painful. So Justin started treatment. And it was treatment that I knew had the possibility of making him ineligible for trial should that standard of care fail. But luckily, Justin did achieve remission. He achieved it very quickly. And a bone marrow transplant donor was found, though not a perfect match. And we began to prepare for a transplant. But then a miracle happened. A true miracle happened. Because in preparation for that transplant, Justin had to stop all treatment. And as a result, that brain fog lifted and his thinking cleared. And he asked me just days before he was to be admitted to start transplant, he asked me, Mom, is it too late to find other options? And the thing was, it wasn't too late. Because I was fortunate enough to know people. I knew who to call, who with just one call was able to get us in touch with one of the leading leukemia physicians in the world. And that doctor told us that not only were there other treatment protocols other than the standard of care, other than bone marrow transplant, already in use, but that those protocols were yielding 70% cure rates, 70% cure rates, and we knew nothing about them. Our doctors, my son's doctors, had not shared that news with us. So the next morning, instead of driving my son to the hospital to begin the bone marrow transplant procedure, we Ubered to the airport and we hopped a plane to Cincinnati, where my son, through our connections, had been squeezed into the schedule and accepted into their program. So my son's chances of living jumped by greater than 20% with just one phone call. And that made us think, if a 70% chance of survival existed, maybe, just maybe, there was something even better out there. So my brother-in-law and I began working the phones and reaching out to everyone we knew within the world of clinical trials. And at the same time, on that same day, which just happened to be my son's 25th birthday, Justin came across a paper authored by Dr. Elias Jabbour. And Dr. Jabbour is a member of the leukemia team at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas. And he is the leading expert in the world on Ph-positive ALL. And that paper reported the findings of a long-running trial headed by Dr. Jabbour and his team. And those findings said that 85 to 90% of Ph-positive ALL patients in the trial hit that magic 5-year survival milestone. 85 to 90% of those patients were being cured. Can you even imagine the hope that we felt? I mean, what a huge difference. Just a week earlier, we were told that my child, had less than a 50% chance of survival with the traditional standard of care. And we were also told that the most cutting edge standard of care offered just a 70% chance of survival. And that was only being offered to a very limited number of patients in Cincinnati. But as our luck would have it, Dr. Jabbour's telephone number was on the paper and I called him. He didn't answer, but I left a detailed explanation of my son's situation, and he returned our call in less than an hour. And he said to me, whatever you do, do not let your son get a bone marrow transplant. The odds are he will die if he chooses that treatment. Get him to Houston, and if he's still in remission, I will accept him into my trial. I will accept him into my trial. And that's exactly what we did. And that's exactly what happened. And that was the best birthday gift my son had ever received. So March 9th of this year marked Justin's 18th month in remission. And the trials data says that those patients who hit that milestone have less than a 5% chance of relapse. Or said another way, my son has a 95% chance of survival, of cure. And there are two things you need to take from Justin's story. And here they are. The first is that people get cancer. It happens every single day. No one expects it. And when it happens, people have a hard time thinking. Their heads are not clear. Whether it's the patient or the people that love them, no one is thinking clearly. On top of that, some patients like my son are already so sick that their thinking is affected by the disease itself. They don't know it. And when that happens, mistakes are made. And when that happens, mistakes are made. Mistakes that cost people their lives. So the first lesson from Justin's story is to give yourself and those that you love the very best chance of survival in this way. Should a cancer diagnosis be received, draw up medical power of attorneys that clearly lay out the wishes of each person and do it now. Do it before someone is diagnosed with cancer. Do it so that they cannot make the mistakes that so many make because they're incapable of thinking, incapable of making sound decisions. Don't let them die because you don't have a power of attorney already in place before a diagnosis. The second thing I want you to know is that my son's path into his trial is by far an anomaly. I knew people. My brother-in-law knew people. And those people paved the way for my son's admission into the clinical trial that is saving his life. But most people don't even know that these trials exist. And if they do know they exist, they don't know how to get into these trials. They don't know that treatment can eliminate them from the very trials that can save their lives. Most people can't jump on a plane at a moment's notice like we were able to do and hole up in hotels and rent apartments in new cities so that they can take part in clinical trials. I want to change that. I envision a world where all people have a clear and easy path to life-saving trials. And so, as committed as I am to my missions, my next mission is to make that happen, to create a foundation that helps cancer patients and their caregivers to navigate the world of clinical trials and to access resources to make participation easier so that they, like my son, get the very best chance of survival. So that's my family's journey with cancer. I hope that you will heed the lessons that we had to learn the hard way. And if you do heed these lessons that I now carry within me, should you find yourself joining me in my family business, you'll be ready and your odds of survival will be dramatically improved.
Jeanette, that was such a beautiful moment. Thank you so much. I'm so thankful for everything. This journey of yours, like I said, is phenomenal. The lessons you taught are life-saving. And again, getting to the nitty-gritty and becoming vulnerable and allowing the audience to really see what you went through for the greater good is just, I mean, you're a hero. So thank you so much. I'm just so blessed to have you on the show. Thank you kindly.
I can't thank you enough. And for your viewers out there, I want to thank you for bearing with me as I shared with you my very long story. But I truly do hope that you will take note of the lessons that we've learned, because I guarantee you, should you face the things that we have faced, they will help save lives. So Kim, thanks again.
Thank you so much. Where can we find you?
So you can find me in two places. First of all, you can find me on my commercial website, Learn to Learn Now, and that is learnnow.com. You can reach me through that website through our contact forms. You can also reach me through our foundation at steppingupforchildreninneed.org, where again you can reach me through a contact form, and also can review our blog articles, which we post every week, that are there to support those children in need and their parents or caregivers.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. I cannot wait to give you the biggest hug when I'm back in Denver. You're amazing.
I know. Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much for letting me tell my story. It means the world to me.
As it does for me and so many other people. Again, thank you for being a part of the Awakening series. Thank you, audience, for all of your time. It was a pleasure.
Okay, I'll see you when you get back in Denver.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.